this is the classical diagram of a flying junction, where a bridge is built so the trains don't block one another. So the up train going straight ahead goes underneath the bridge of the train wanting to go to the right, and similarly the down train goes under the bridge so that the down train and the up train never block one another. The alternative is, of course, that the single track goes underneath the two tracks. But the key thing is, by building this bridge, trains don't block one another and you get higher frequency of movement. For railways and trains to be efficient, they need to be able to move quickly from one place to another without having to wait around. In Adelaide, South Australia, this line through Mount Barker is now engaged to the trains in Greater Adelaide. These freight trains are going largely from Melbourne to Perth and return, and 90% of the freight between those two cities is actually travelling on this railway line. There are 2 points where the freight trains and the city trains come into conflict. This is the Adelaide Parklands railway station, which is the standard gauge intercity and intra-regional station using standard gauge, and this is the Adelaide terminal station using broad gauge. The freight trains from Melbourne and Perth travel on the western side of this right-of-way and around on this triangle to the junction here, which is the Torrens junction, and the freight trains carry on. At this point, the 2.8 kilometres long freight trains cut across the track for the trains going from and to the city of Adelaide and Port Adelaide, Outer Harbour and Grange. And this is the River Torrens, and the most recent of the flying junctions we have is the what's called the Torrens Junction, and this view is taken when the flying junction was in the process of being built. This outer western line is the freight line. The two tracks here were the original Port Adelaide Outer Harbour Grange line for passenger trains, and these trains couldn't negotiate this junction during busy times if the freight trains, which are 2.8 kilometres long, were also scheduled, so that there was a standoff until they built the Flying Junction. And this is what the Flying Junction now looks like at ground level. The Gawler line and the freight train line go over the top of the Outer Harbour line. This shows the morning rush period, 7:30 to 8:30 at the Torrens junction. We can see that the trains on the outer harbour line, 8 up and 7 down, can move through the junction without any interference from the Goodwood train line, 8 up, 5 down, and the interstate trains. Similarly, afternoon, the 4 up and 7 down on the outer harbour line have no interference from the 4 up and 6 down on the Goodwood line and the interstate line. The other Flying Junction is at Goodwood. This is the Goodwood railway station. The black line here is the original South Terrace to Glenelg railway line, which is a private railway line, and this right of way at one point during the 1950s was going to be the way in which an underground railway line was taken into the City of Adelaide underneath King William Street, but it didn't occur. But what has happened in recent time is the building of the Goodwood Junction, Flying Junction. This is the portal for the Seaford and Tonsley Line to go underneath the 2 tracks of line, 1 track being standard gauge, which is on the left, and 1 track of broad gauge, which is for the Lille passenger line. This is the view showing the portal for the Seaford Tonsley line going underneath the Lille line and the ARTC freight line.
Commuter train is also only a single track, so the Hills line really should be 4 tracks, not 2.
This shows the morning train movements at the Goodwood Flying Junction in 7:30 to 8:30 in the morning. We can see that the trains on the Lille line, which is a single track, 4 up and 2 down on the single track, and the trains on the Seaford line, Tonsley line, 12 up and 7 down, can move through the junction without any interference with one another. Similarly, in the afternoon, the 2 up and 4 down the Lille line and the 7 up and 10 down on the Seaford Tonsley line can move through the junction without any interference with one another. We now come out on the Seaford line to the point where there's a junction at Ascot Park for the line to Tonsley. This is the old Tonsley site, which is now being redeveloped as a major tertiary and industry site. And just here is the Flinders Medical Centre and Flinders University, which is also a major employer. And so the railway line, which currently terminates at the Tonsley railway station, is being extended over the South Road at the Darlington upgrade to a new railway station at Flinders Medical Centre. the suggestion is that the large amount of passenger usage on the Seaford line and the number of people who would want to use the Tonsley line or the Flinders line would be so great that a Flying Junction possibly would be needed at Ascot Park. This is the current Ascot Park railway station with a train, a down train from the city at the station, and this is the current junction. At this point the Tonsley line has got two tracks, but a bit further south of here the Tonsley line becomes a single track, and it's suggested that this is a congestion point for train movement on these two highly important railway lines. Ascot Park Station, looking towards the Flinders link to Flinders Medical Centre and Flinders University at the end of the Tonsley line. With the junction with the Seaford line. The down train on the Seaford line. There's some crossing over the pedestrian crossing with a pram. Presumably going into the city to get a extra load of passengers. In fact, it's a 6-car train. 6-car train. Down train to Tonsley. Seems to be extended with the Flinders link to Flinders Medical Centre and Flinders University. Going to Seaford. Train waiting to come across the intersection, the level cross, the junction. Been waiting for the up train from Seaford to cross over the junction. At this point there's a potential for a collision between the trains coming down from Tonsley and the up trains from Tonsley and the down trains from the city to Seaford coming into conflict. This is the Ascot Park Junction, and we see that the Tonsley line and the Seaford line come into conflict at this point here, where the down trains and the up trains have to pass one another, and we therefore have 7 occasions, 3 plus 4, in an hour where the trains are in conflict with one another in the morning. In the afternoon, the kind of number of conflicts rises to 10 an hour. This means that any expansion of the Tonsley line above 3 trains an hour is going to be basically impossible. At 12 trains an hour, the Tonsley line, so the Seaford line and Tonsley line at this point is basically reaching capacity. About 14 trains an hour is the maximum that a single railway line can carry with normal signalling systems. It suggested that this Seaford line and Tonsley line at Ascot Park, that a Flying Junction would be desirable. There are many examples of flying junctions in the rail systems of New York City in New York State, and in Queens there is the JFK Airport, which the authority which runs the airport has built a driverless train, the SkyTrain, similar to the one in Vancouver, BC, which links up the terminal buildings. At this point there's a junction where the train goes out of the airport to Howard's Beach station, and another branch goes to Jamaica station. The junction is just alongside the Federal Circle station, and if we go down to ground level, we can see the classical Flying Junction. So we have tracks going underneath other tracks. So this track here is the track going to Howard's Beach, and this track is the track from Jamaica station. So we can see that by having this Flying Junction, trains can move without interference with one another at reasonably high speeds because there are no breaks in the track.
This is a Howard Beach train, stopping at Lefferts Boulevard and Howard Beach for long-term parking, as well as connections to the AirTrain. Ladies and gentlemen, the AirTrain fee is $5. Passengers can purchase a Metro card at either Jamaica or Howard Beach station. Thank you for riding AirTrain JFK.
And there are many other examples of Flying Junction in New York City. This is the Fretin triangle in France. We can see, in fact, the Fretin triangle consists of 3 flying junctions. In France, the trains, like Australia, Japan and England, all are travelling on the left-hand side, and the diagram is showing that the trains from Paris going to London can be joined by trains from Brussels, at this point of conflict being removed by the bridge. So the trains from London can go to Brussels, or go underneath via 2 bridges to Paris, and trains from Brussels can go to London, the bridges, or through to Paris. The triangle is rather large at a distance of 3 kilometres on each of the limbs, but the trains can still go at 300 kilometres an hour. The most famous of this triangles with flying junctions occurs on the high-speed train system at near Lille, at Fretin, this is the line from and to London, the line to and from Brussels, and the line to and from Paris. So at ground level we can see this track at a higher level to this one, and what's happening is the lower track is going to go underneath the other arm of the triangle, and there are 3 places where we've got flying junctions. Each of the limbs of the triangle has got lines which go over or underneath. So we can see the limb from Paris is going underneath the limb from Paris to Brussels. And the third one the limb from London to Brussels, and from London to Paris there's another flying junction. Here's one of the high-speed trains travelling on one of the limbs of the triangle. One of the most extreme examples of flying junctions is in Sydney, Australia, in the state of New South Wales. This is Greater Sydney and the train system. This is the famous CBD of Sydney, with the Sydney Opera House and the Harbour Bridge, which is carrying trains to the North Shore. And underneath Sydney there's a whole complex of railway lines, and on the southern side of Sydney is Central Railway Station, which is a terminal station for the intercity. That's Sydney, Adelaide, Sydney, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra trains, and also the country trains. In New South Wales, the country trains of an older generation actually have a different, what's called train gauge. The curves and so on are different to the suburban trains, so there's actually 2 systems of trains in Sydney. And then you've got the metropolitan trains, more modern trains of famous electric trains, double-deck trains. At this point, Central Station, there's actually a very complicated flying junction between Central Station and Redfern Station, where the trains coming from the south line from Illawarra, which is actually a mixture of express trains and local trains, so there are actually 4 tracks for the Illawarra line, and from the western line, so on. All the trains coming from the Redfern stations towards Central Station to this Central Station are on the upper level, and the trains going from Central Station towards Redfern are on the lower level. There's a separate line here which is going to the airport, which is a separate to the Flying Junction. This is a diagram of the Flying Junctions between Central Station and Redfern, and we see that the up trains, the trains going into Central, are all going on the upper deck of the Flying Junctions, whilst the trains, or down trains, the trains leaving Central, are on the lower deck in this 2-layer Flying Junction system. It also means that the up trains, we can see, can find their way either to Town Hall or to Museum, and similarly any trains from Museum or Town Hall can find the way back out onto these alternative lines out from Redfern. Because what we've got in Sydney is the circle route in the city has been modified so that now the train are no longer terminating in the centre of Sydney. It's a balloon loop for the circle line, where the inner circle goes to Museum and around and back out, and the outer goes to Town Hall in a clockwise direction, and the shoreline goes from Town Hall across the bridge to the North Shore. The line to the eastern suburbs is a separate line to these others. So this is a simulation of it. Train coming from the underground line, and these are the trains going west from Central, and on the other side the simulations remove the intra-city trains, so that you see that trains can move from one place to another without any interference with one another. This YouTube video shows the Redfern Flying Junction in action. So the trains are from all different directions, all coming together, and there's no waiting around as they cross over one junction. They junctions are above or below one another. But the key thing is, by building this bridge trains don't block one another and you get higher frequency of movement.